Now, how does that relate to some of what we also read for today in terms of the Anthony Caro interview with Norman Foster? Anthony Caro is a British sculptor who created these kind of monumental pieces using mostly painted metal, like we see here, in abstract composition. So a lot of similarities to what we saw when we looked at a new monumentality. What is a new monumental post-war sculpture going to look like? So he's interested in that, but he also is very much interested in the architectural associations. What did you think about that reading, that interview between him and the architect Norman Foster? I thought it was interesting how they each related to the other's discipline, how one informs the other, and they could see the connections between the two. I thought that was really interesting. Obviously, one of the main issues is scale, you know. Something that always comes to my mind is, besides scale, site specificity. Now, I don't think that's something that Anthony Caro particularly cares about, at least from the reading. It didn't seem like he was thinking too much about site specificity. He doesn't make it for that purpose. He likes the idea that his sculpture is going to move around from place to place. I thought that was kind of interesting. He didn't believe in this kind of like permanent sculpture that others we've seen have. I should say the title of that interview between them, The Poetics of Space, that comes from an essay by Gaston Bachelard. So I just wanted to take one quote by Anthony Caro from that piece where he said, quote, "At one time I was trying to formulate what sculpture is and what it could be. It is a thing you are outside of. Then I started worrying about why it was necessary to be outside of it. Could not an internal space also be sculpture? Could it sometimes be a thing you were inside of as well, like architecture? Something I jokingly called sculptitecture. Sculptitecture. I liked that little quote about sculptitecture. It shows how closely associated in his mind it is and how that line is kind of blurred a lot of the time. And I know he said he's not a fan of like permanent sculptures, but he does have this permanent installation in Yorkshire, in England, that I found this YouTube kind of like virtual tour of that I'd like to check out with you. So this is the Yorkshire Promenade and several of his works that you can check out and walk amongst. So I think it's important to get a sense of the scale. So it's a piece that you can kind of be inside of and outside of what he was talking about as sculptitecture. So I thought in that sense it was a good example to check out. And what a lot of these forms tend to start looking like to me, because of the specific materials used, that and the visibility of their joints, it reminds me a lot of like industrial kind of spaces, whether we're talking about actual buildings or maybe like ships or things like that, silos. It really has that kind of evocative industrial kind of feeling to it. So it's maybe something that plays upon architectural forms, but at the same time retains its sculptural quality. And I wonder now, if we're looking at that and how it kind of retains its sculptural quality, are there buildings then that start to verge on the sculptural as well? Norman Foster was the architect who he was having that conversation with. And he's probably the best known for what they affectionately call the Gherkin building in London, because it looks kind of like a pickle. That's on the left there, and on the right is Hearst Tower in New York City. They're both from the early 2000s. And so you can see he's making good use of showcasing the structure of the building. So it's using the materials and the underlying structure as a kind of decorative element, really highlighting the use of glass in particular. So kind of like beautiful effects that can be achieved using all of that glazing. The Hearst building is one of my favorites in New York. So to kind of compare and contrast Norman Foster's buildings and that kind of sculptural quality that they have, showcasing and not trying to hide some of the structure of the piece of the building. See, I'm talking about his buildings as if they're artworks, because they kind of are. And compare that to Anthony Caro. So what do you think? Do you see some other similarities between the two of them? And I'm wondering also if anything comes to mind from the reading that you did. Was there something that Norman Foster wrote about that made you think he was looking at architecture from more of a sculptural point of view? And finally, I'd wonder, what do you think about the purpose and the benefits of looking at your own discipline from another perspective? So if you're a sculptor, is there a benefit to looking at your work from an architectural point of view, or to working with an architect or talking with an architect about your work? Is there a benefit if you're an architect to talk to a sculptor or a city planner, to look at this from many different sides? Because clearly public art should be, if it's successful, a collaborative endeavor. And talking to those different groups of people, I think, is part of what ensures that success. And speaking of collaborations, one that I've done a lot of work researching and writing about is the collaboration between the artist Donald Judd, he was a minimalist artist we looked at last time, and his partner Loretta Venturelli, who was born in Italy, trained as an architect, and also was a fine artist. She made watercolors later in her life. They collaborated on a few projects together in the 1980s, late 70s and 80s, including this one for Providence, Rhode Island, which envisioned this kind of like stepped platform that would go in front of City Hall in Providence. And they envisioned this site as a place for public discourse. So it used to be the site of an old theater. So they're envisioning this almost kind of like amphitheater in this kind of raised or elevated stepped platform where people could gather. It was never actually constructed anyways, but it's that kind of close collaboration between an architect and an artist, looking at a project from those different points of view, that would be a recipe for success. Venturelli, being a trained architect, was always helping Donald Judd kind of translate some of his ideas into more like realistic form. So he would have this idea that he might sketch out, and this is his sketch on the right here. And then she would try to like translate that into architectural forms and make that a reality in terms of engineering and in terms of structure and materials. So really, especially when you're talking about a large-scale public sculpture that verges on architecture, you have to collaborate with someone who's well-versed in that area, who has the experience necessary to make that a reality. All right, so to wrap up, we looked at a few examples of the ways that architecture and public sculpture connect, and some of the ways that they overlap and intersect. And we're going to continue some of those conversations on the discussion boards this week. So please contribute, participate, let us know what you think. We'll be hearing from Kayla and Debbie about the Tarkowski and the Nauman, and kind of push that conversation a little bit further about what the connection between architecture and large-scale public sculpture is. For next week, we'll be talking about commissions, public response, and controversy. Discussion boards, those are going to be due by Wednesday at 11:59. I should say that the discussion board and the reading will be due by Wednesday. And then we have Dana and Nick presenting on Gene Heistine and Tony Tassett. Those discussion boards, they'll have posted their intro by Wednesday, and then you will contribute to the conversation by Sunday. And then finally, the research paper rough draft is due by April 1st at 11:59 p.m. I'm going to be reaching out to you all to talk about your progress and see how things are going this week. So stay tuned for that as well. Until next time, I hope you all have a great week, and I'll see you on the discussion boards.